Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. I'm continuing my exploration of Marillion's music, but keep in mind it's a very specific period in Marillion's career. I'm just looking at the first 4 albums on which Fish, Derek Dick, also known as Fish, was the lead singer. This is the third in the series. The album is called Misplaced Childhood. Now, if you're a Marillion fan, you probably already know and love this album. If you're not a Marillion fan or don't know anything about Marillion, especially the Fish period, this would probably be like the one album to get if you were going to get one of them. It is by far the biggest album of both Fish and Marillion's career. Despite being a progressive rock album in 1985, it produced a pretty major hit for the band in the UK, and a minor hit in the US. Maybe you could have caught it on 120 Minutes or something like that late at night. A song called Kaylee.
I just wanna say I'm sorry, but Kaylee, I'm too scared to pick up the phone. To hear you find another lover to patch up our broken home. Kaylee, I'm still trying to write that love song. Kaylee, it's more important to me now you're gone. Maybe it will prove that we were right, or it'll prove that I was wrong.
And that song got them quite a bit of visibility within certain regions. But as usually is the case, that single doesn't really reflect this album. Misplaced Childhood is a progressive rock album, and actually a very important part of progressive rock history, in fact. Considering where the band was coming from, it was a pretty ambitious step. Marillion had been around since around 1981, and they'd had a few minor hits here and there locally, and the record company was really trying to push them to get a big hit out. And their previous album, Fugazi, had done a little bit less well than their debut album, Script for a Jester's Tear. But they spent a lot of money on it, particularly, and quite a bit of money, I think, on some of the videos that they put out for that album. So they were looking at having some problems being solvent at this point. Even though they were kind of gaining a following, there was still a little bit of pressure for them to put something together that was going to be a big deal for them. So if you look at Fugazi as their Caress of Steel, then this is kind of like their 2112. There's a lot of pressure going into it, just like Rush had coming out of Caress of Steel to make a big album. And rather than kind of kowtow to record company pressure to make a single, they decide to spread their ambition even further and make a concept album, maybe even arguably a rock opera. All the songs segue from one to the other. There's only one point in the album where it doesn't segue, and that's when, back in the days of vinyl and cassettes, at the end of side 1, beginning of side 2, there's a bit of a break there. But if you're a person that listens to music streaming, this could be a bit of a problem for you. This is kind of an issue with some of the older music where segues were really important, and listening to an album in a full setting was intended, because a lot of times you'll have gaps that show up between the tracks. And that really can disturb the experience, because one of the things that's really amazing about Misplaced Childhood is Marillion's ability to segue from one thing to another. It really is not designed to be listened to song by song by song. And if you didn't have a track list, if you didn't have a way to break it apart, you probably wouldn't know where one song started and the other one stopped in a very specific way. You kind of hear where things would change. But generally speaking, it's a whole experience. It should be listened to from beginning to end. And it also, I think, has a storyline that's meant to be told from beginning to end. And the storyline is kind of also a bit of an innovation here for Marillion, and specifically for Fish. Fish was a very brilliant lyricist, and on Fugazi, he kind of showed that he knew that. And it got a little bit overly melodramatic in spots, and he was really kind of reaching in some ways. So one of the things that happened for this album was that he was able to kind of, even though he was keeping this highly allegorical and metaphoric approach to his lyrics, very poetic style of writing, he was able to kind of ground it in a very real world experiences. In a way, Misplaced Childhood is kind of autobiographical. A lot of the things that happen over the course of the lyrics in this album tell a story that's coming from things that Fish experienced. And even in some cases, you have references to people that actually existed, and he didn't even change the names. The big hit from this album was the song Kaylee. And Kaylee was Fish's girlfriend at one point in time, and they had a falling out and they broke up. And there was some contention in the band, actually, as to whether or not he should continue to use that person's name. But he insisted that he was going to keep the person, Kaylee, that person's name in the song, and not change it. So he really wanted to ground it in the real world. But the actual album concept came to him while he was on an acid trip. And he spent an evening basically like inside of a painting. This is one of the things that keeps the album from feeling too grounded. It has this sense of being otherworldly, of being kind of hallucinogenic, but at the same time it's very rooted in real life experiences that Fish was recounting in the course of telling the story. Now, trying to unravel Fish's metaphor is always an interesting endeavor, because on the one hand, again, especially on Misplaced Childhood, they feel very familiar, they feel very grounded in reality. But then he has these references to things that I think that if you're not Scottish, if you're not coming from his culture, then you might miss them. It's kind of like watching a Miyazaki movie. You know, if you watch Miyazaki movies, he has all these references to Japanese culture that don't really make sense. They seem kind of fanciful, but they're very grounded in folklore of being a child of Japan. I think the same thing happens here. You know, Fish really started to embrace his Scottish heritage a little bit on this album. Not that he broke out any bagpipes or anything, but you'll start to see him in some of his videos wearing kilts and referring specifically musically to things that are very specifically Scottish. You know, he has a song in here called Heart of Lothian, which is a reference to a place in Scotland. He's referring to it kind of like his homeland in some ways. And without knowing what that is and the inferences there, it's a little bit lost on a non-Scottish listener. Still sounds good, but you have to kind of maybe do a little bit of research to know what he's referring to.
And the tickles of the light, fantastic. Bow down, hold down. Spray the pheromones on this perfume uniform. And Anarchy smiles in the Royal Mile. And we're waiting on the flyboys, wild boys. Rootin' tootin' cowboys, lucky little ladies love the watering hole. They'll score the Friday night goals. I was born with a heart of Lothian.
As much as Marillion has a deference to Genesis, there's also quite a bit of a connection with the music of Pink Floyd. And I don't think it's a stretch to see that as much as Fish is probably visually influenced by Genesis, especially at this point, I think that the influence of Roger Waters on his lyric approach is starting to kind of show up. And he had mentioned during the course of trying to make Fugazi that he wanted to make a rock opera. And I think this was sort of his attempt to do that. But, you know, rock operas and concept albums kind of exist on a spectrum. You know, on the one hand, a concept album is an album that's sort of bound together by one single idea. And a rock opera is one that kind of has a sense of linearity to it. And there's characters and they evolve and there's a climax to it. And these things aren't always mutually exclusive. You know, I think that there's a spectrum here that exists. And if I'm going to, on a spectrum, you know, of a concept album to the Wall or something like that, that this lies pretty far over towards that side. It feels like a rock opera because there's definitely a sense of things happening in a certain order to the character in the story. For example, the album starts off with the song Kaylee, which is all about the character, Fish's character, breaking up with a person he deeply cared about, that he deeply loved, and questioning himself as to if it was his fault or that person's fault or whatever else. And the rest of the story, the rest of the album kind of spools out from that experience, trying to find some way to fill that hole. But there's a climax, a definite climax, I think, to this piece. When you get to the second side, a song on there called Blind Curve. Now, Blind Curve is a multi-movement piece. The character has this sort of collision course with reality and fame and all this other stuff when he gets a call saying that a friend of his had died.
Oh, I remember Toronto with Milo and I. We sat and we cried on the phone. I never felt so alone. He was the first of our own. Some of us go down in a blaze of obscurity. Some of us go down in a haze of publicity. The price of infamy, the edge of insanity. Another holiday and another temporary home, and an interviewer threatened me with a microphone to talk to me. Won't you tell me your story?
And this is also based on a real world experience. Milo was a friend of Fish's, was a friend of the band's, and he was a drummer for a band, I think called Rage or something like that. But they received this call when they were touring with Rush, and Fish was very broken up about that. And this whole part of the song is about that. And he walks out from hearing that this had happened, and he has to talk to a person who wants to do an interview with him or for a magazine because, you know, his character is now famous. And he takes some sort of drugs or something, has this introspective trip where he examines himself and finds this, you know, the hole that he has in his life that he keeps trying to fill with women and with everything else is actually just his own childhood that he wants to reconnect with. There's really not a very clear sense of this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened. So in a sense, it doesn't really fit the exact description of a rock opera, but it feels like one because I think there's a sense of linearity to the album. The character starts in one place and has a realization about something because of things that happened to him and changes because of that experience. Now, I would be remiss if we got this far in the game and I didn't talk about the album art for Misplaced Childhood, because I've made mention of all the album art of Marillion up to this point, and Misplaced Childhood is no exception. It has some very important icons that are new and then have also shown up in previous things. So the new one clearly is the most obvious one, is the kind of the drummer boy. And the drummer boy was actually artist Mark Wilkinson's next door neighbor's kid and ended up just having the look that they wanted. So, you know, they put him in the drummer boy suit and used him as the main sort of character for the cover. But just on to his side there, you have a poppy flower again. That is a holdover from Fugazi. You'll see on the previous album Fugazi, the character there was holding a poppy flower. Also, there's a ring beside him, and that ring beside him, although there's no specific mention of it in Misplaced Childhood, Fish likes to refer to wedding rings very often. So that's one that's not quite as clear to me. But also you'll see that the boy is holding a magpie, and the magpie showed up on Fugazi. There's also a magpie on the back cover. The magpie is sitting on top of a cage that's holding a chameleon on it. The chameleon icon goes all the way back to Script for a Jester's Tear, which refers to a song that was on Fugazi. Also, the floor, if you take a look at the floor of the back picture, there's puzzle pieces. And the jigsaw is a reference to a song from Fugazi as well. Very, very obviously, you can see on the back cover too, the jester, which has been like Fish's main avatar since the get-go, is escaping out of a window. And it was my understanding that Fish saw Misplaced Childhood as sort of the last part of a trilogy, and he had planned on having the jester exit the scene. That was his cue to Mark Wilkinson when they were talking about making this album art. So again, you see all these really cool things tying together all the way back from Script for a Jester's Tear, these icons showing back up, and then they're building on themselves as they go along. It's very fascinating. And I really attribute a lot of the success of Marillion, their packaging, to Mark Wilkinson. As important to Marillion's image as Roger Dean was, I think, to Yes's image in the 70s. Very important to the way they presented themselves. If you haven't listened to Misplaced Childhood and put it in your collection, please do. It is, in my opinion, probably a prog rock landmark. You know, it saved progressive rock in the 80s. And it's as good as and distinct from 70s progressive rock at its best. But it was done in 1985 and turned the opinion around on progressive rock at the time. There were other bands trying to do progressive rock. You know, there was Palace was out there, Saga was out there, It Bites was out there. But at that same time, all the progressive rock icons were becoming more pop. So it was definitely a marginalized style at that time to be a kind of a hardcore, classy progressive rock stylist. But Marillion was doing it and was doing it very successfully in 1985. And they would continue doing that throughout the 80s with Fish. So I would highly suggest going out and getting Misplaced Childhood. It's an important album. And then keep your ears to the ground for the next post that I have coming up by liking and subscribing and sharing. Because this next post is going to be Clutching at Straws, which, although I think that Misplaced Childhood might be Marillion's best album, I think that Clutching at Straws is probably my favorite. And I'm going to tell you why next time I see you guys on the flip side.